floors with a booming system. Top down AC with the cooling system. When he come up in the club, he be blazing up. He got stacks on deck like he's saving up.
Okay, Ryan Murphy being a barb. Honestly, this video has been a long time coming, and since nobody seemed to want to make a critical analysis of the entire span of Ryan Murphy's career and body of work thus far, the task seems to have been relegated to me. Let me begin by saying that this video essay will be extremely opinionated because, hello, it's my opinion. But I'm going to do my best at presenting these topics with enough background and information to give my point of view some reference. Feel free to disagree, even loathe my existence. Just know that I don't care. There is a lot to say about the breadth of work that Ryan Murphy has produced for television. And honestly, although this video may seem harsh at times, it's a critical analysis, I also think he's done a fair amount of good at being able to produce progressive storylines and sneaking them into his shows that are aired at mainstream American audiences. Just because I'm critical of him doesn't mean I don't like him. In fact, I feel I'm so critical because I want him to succeed with the show he creates, but unfortunately, as we've seen many times, he leaves his projects out to fend for themselves, and once he's done caring about them, they don't usually survive for much longer after. If they do, it's kind of like keeping a dog alive that should have been put down years ago, only instead of a sickly dog, it's a TV show using naked men as a way to lure in viewers. This video will be covering many topics pertaining to Murphy's career, including the ways in which he has revolutionized television, created unique projects that are unlike anything else being produced in the media stratosphere at the time, and has queer television in a way that has allowed for mainstream audiences to identify and normalize with certain aspects of queer subculture and humor. However, there are caveats to his success, not limited to his messy storylines, decline in quality between seasons of shows, interesting casting choices, and last but not least, a forced perspective on historical narratives that may or may not be entirely truthful for audiences. I've debated how to properly navigate these topics while also giving some of his shows their in-depth due process, and have decided to highlight his more mainstream TV projects while addressing how his commonalities as a showrunner seem to reappear throughout his breadth of work. So, without further ado, let's begin our story with 1999 and Ryan Murphy's first show, Popular.
And then, because I had such an awful week, Mama is going to take me on a special Arctic whaling expedition. And then, by the light of the awe-inspiring Aurora Borealis, we're going hunting for baby seals!
When looking back at the span of Ryan Murphy's career, it's not insane to see how he has convinced networks to take such big risks with his unorthodox show ideas. Pretty much from the get, Murphy wanted to play outside of the rules of what a traditional show at the time needed to be in order to be successful among audiences. His first show, Popular, was a parody of the cinema landscape during the late 90s and early 2000s. The show centers around two high school girls who were polar opposites, forced to get along through the diaspora of their own cliques because their parents abruptly fell in love while they met on a cruise ship. At first glance, it would appear that this show seems baseline, even boring, cliché. It's like if The Parent Trap took place in high school. However, this show aired against the backdrop of a cinematic landscape that saw the rise of insanely high amounts of high school rom-coms, such as 10 Things I Hate About You, She's All That, American Pie, Drive Me Crazy, all of these movies coming out in the same year as Murphy's show. With these movies creating and cementing the absurdist tropes of These are the best years of your life, and this 45-year-old is definitely 16, and let's not forget, you and your soulmate will definitely meet in high school. Popular attempts to satirize and parody the teen rom-com genre. Murphy, taking note of this shifting landscape and growing teen media, was able to deliver in many ways the prototype to what would soon become a film genre of itself, the not another parody genre. With absurdist, over-the-top acting, cliche but intentionally cliche plot lines, and all the dramedy of an early 2000s teen rom-com, it wasn't necessarily a huge ratings draw for the network, but it was the first time that Murphy began to play with pre-existing notions of what a TV show needed to be in order to air, or even be renewed. Murphy's next project, Nip Tuck, is actually one of his more traditional shows, as it did not play much with genre, parody, or scope. Although it was an instant cable hit, it did not seem to be revolutionary in the ways that his next two TV projects would be. However, the commercial success garnered from Nip Tuck definitely helped build his credibility as a showrunner that was fresh-faced and oozing with the ability to make networks money. And that's pretty important because in the mid to late 2000s, television had begun to feel very static. It was experiencing a huge lull. Most network shows were sitcoms or serial dramas sticking to a generic batch of genres like cop show, medical show, comedy, drama, Friends, but not Friends. It didn't experience much experimentation or deviation from the norm. The rise of the internet saw audiences veering away from traditional media, as television seemed to remain the same, and viewers were more inclined to watch shorter videos and sketches of more original, personalized content for entertainment on websites like YouTube. This period of time saw growing experimentation on television as networks were beginning to notice their declining viewership in the growing digital era. They knew they needed to try something new to regenerate audience intrigue. That's how Murphy was able to get his next project made. That's right, as much as we love to hate it, Glee was not only a major turning point in Ryan Murphy's career, but also in the shifting landscape of network TV. Glee was released in 2009 as a dramedy centering around the lives of a select group of Ohio teens who were outcasts in their school, and they were glued together by their shared musicality and desire to do what they love: show choir. Although the plot doesn't seem like it's anything particularly new, what was really revolutionary for the project was that it had become the first time a diegetic musical television show would make it on air, breaking into a genre that had never been explored on the medium before. Musicals were, of course, for the stage, and for a select few made into grandiose movies fit for the big screen. There were the awkward musical episodes of shows like Buffy the Vampire Slayer and That 70s Show, but creating a serial dramedy that featured musicality in every episode, covering artists from Journey to Meghan Trainor, and even including a few songs that were completely original, had never been done before. Of course, Glee went on to be a huge success among audiences and was renewed for several seasons. We'll talk about it. Yikes. Ultimately, however, Glee revealed to networks that shows could break the mold of genre and invigorate audiences to return to their TV screens, up the ratings of the channel, and, of course, make a lot of money. Murphy's next project, American Horror Story, once again broke the genre rules of television by making horror appropriate for the small screen for the first time. You see, horror on television had never been super successful, especially in the ways it had for movies. Shows with horror elements usually deviated from traditional horror tropes and were instead grouped with other genres like sci-fi, fantasy, or mystery. Think The Twilight Zone, Supernatural, or Twin Peaks. And although these shows have lived on in our memories, it's mostly because they had very dedicated cult followings, not necessarily large followings that made them commercially successful. American Horror Story, however, was more true to the horror genre that we've seen in cinema. Gritty, suspenseful, psychological, and thrilling. Paired with paranormal elements and gore to boot, the show brought big screen horror to network television for the first time. Something else that made American Horror Story revolutionary for television as well, and has since become synonymous with Murphy's work, is that it was an anthology series, meaning each season would be its own succinct storyline with its own cast of characters and plot lines, or lack thereof sometimes. We'll talk about it. Playing not only with genre, but also with how the show is serialized, all while being yet another critical success, cemented Murphy's status as a hot new show creator with unique ideas, guaranteed to draw in audiences and cultivate large devoted followings for networks. It's weird to look at what Murphy has produced sometimes and think, how the hell did he get this project greenlit? But when looking at his history and how he was able to make risks in television hugely successful for these studios, you come to understand that networks are willing to run with his ideas, if it means giving them a show as profitable and beloved as Glee or American Horror Story. However, Murphy's golden touch is a bit too true to the legend of King Midas himself.
I had a husband before Gordon.
Oh, okay. All right, well, listen, we can...
I'm due downstairs.
For those of you who don't know the story of King Midas, essentially here's what you need to know. The Greek god Dionysus granted King Midas with one wish to come true. King Midas, needing to think of something that would be beneficial for years to come, and not understanding the evil genie trope, wished that everything he touched would turn to gold. He gets his wish, and everything he touches turns into pure gold. He gets rich from his ability because, hello, unlimited gold, and then he touches his wife and she turns into a solid gold statue, and he realizes the moral of the story, which is don't be greedy, enjoy what you have, and everything you touch may be gold, but eventually that gold will become worthless. Yeah, we're talking about how this became that.
Hips and roll it and touch that hair and roll that pussy. Ugh. Come on, yes!
I first want to talk about his overambition on writing complex storylines. Well, I guess he fumbles the bag even with simple storylines, too. I don't even know where to begin with this. It's sort of what Murphy has become infamous for in retrospect. Let's take Glee, for example.
We're doing the song this Friday at the Pep Assembly.
In front of the whole school?
They're gonna throw fruit at us.
This is not what you needed! Don't stop doing that! Don't stop doing that!
I also took the liberty of highlighting some special ed classes for you. Maybe you could find some recruits. They're special needs kids at McKinley, yet there's no special ed classes, no special ed teacher.
What if I don't want to? I mean, I'm not saying that I don't, but to stay here, work for Bert, I mean, would that be so bad?
I don't understand what any of this means.
It means I suck. It means I'm gonna be stuck here forever.
If I quit Glee Club, my big plans for New York would have been ruined.
And while in New York, Quinn does absolutely nothing.
Barely surviving on the budget we have. Slashing the Glee budget by 10%, cutting our transportation to and from events is like cutting our legs off. I'm singing in the rain, just singing in the rain. What a glorious feeling, I'm happy again.
The good thing is that I'm starting to regain feelings. So with a lot of physical therapy and your prayers, I stand a good chance for full recovery.
1 hour later.
You can walk?
Yeah. Isn't it amazing?
And, you know, I usually can forgive some errors in continuity in a show when it's something like Roger Sterling bought Joan a brown fur mink. When she opens the present, it's a black fur mink. But Ryan Murphy's continuity errors often hinge on the rules of the universe he's created being broken, and also major plot points seem to surround the now confused understanding of a character or situation. This issue also seems to seep into the larger problem with the MIDAS touch, though. And that's the drastic decline in quality between his show's seasons. I cannot even begin to describe how a show that looks as cinematically unique and powerful as season 1 of American Horror Story has devolved into this.
Hit and roll it and touch that hair and roll that pussy. Come on, yes!
And don't say that it was intentional that it looks bad because it's a campy horror movie. It could still look good. But it's not just American Horror Story that's had this issue. Sure, as a show drags on longer and longer, it more often than not will run out of steam at some point. This isn't even a uniquely Ryan Murphy characteristic, as we've seen it happen with even the best of shows. However, while it is common that the writing, plot lines, and even acting of a show can seem tired after a while, the show itself usually either improves or at the very least plateaus in things like visual effects, cinematography, sound mixing, etc., since there's now a bigger budget for such things. But it's almost as if Ryan Murphy can make a cinematic masterpiece one season and then subjects himself to making a dollar store ripoff for the following. I could talk about this in depth with American Horror Story, but I think similarly, and even more interestingly and rapidly, we should talk about the drop in quality between seasons 1 and 2 of American Crime Story. The difference between season 1 and season 2 of this anthology is absolutely, astonishingly insane. Season 1 of American Crime Story centers around the infamous O.J. Simpson case and the murder of Nicole Simpson, O.J.'s then ex-wife. The show starts with the night of Nicole Simpson's murder and covers the following months of O.J. Simpson's life, including the unforgettable Ford Bronco chase, O.J.'s arrest, and the courtroom drama that soon takes place thereafter. If the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit! Or whatever, you know? The show is also able to interestingly dissect the racial landscape of America at the time, including the historic LA riots against police brutality and how that applied to the case and people's perceptions of OJ during the trial. These conversations have only become more poignant since, but it was an intricacy that was delicately and respectfully placed within the anthology of the season, building an understanding of the universe for the show, and also ultimately gave certain characters more depth by explaining how they were able to manipulate racial tensions surrounding them in order to create unique narratives within the show. Everything in the first season feels meaningful, intentional, and loops into the characters and how they interacted with the universe they lived in. The cinematography was amazing. Gritty and gray, the show took on the appearance of a late 90s movie noir, setting the tone for the intense emotional drama that would unfold in the courtroom for most of the series. The costumes were highly detailed and accurate, and hair and makeup spared no expense at going all in on giving audiences as real of an interpretation of Marcia Clark as possible. The score of the show set the mood, with songs feeling natural and real to the times, and the acting. The acting! Cuba Gooding Jr. in maybe the only role I've ever liked him in, Sarah Paulson winning her only Emmy for portraying prosecutor Marcia Clark, and David Schwimmer giving the role of Robert Kardashian a surprisingly real and complex characterization with minimal dialogue and screen time. Also, I feel I need to mention Sterling Brown's portrayal of Christopher Darden and how his acting made the show's stakes that much more believable. The entire first season of this show felt new, original, raw. And then we got season 2. Season 2 of American Crime Story centers around the assassination of fashion mogul Gianni Versace. Although it is a horrific, real crime and murder, since it seemed to have less weight in the national zeitgeist, the show decided to treat this season like a lighthearted retelling of Psycho. Whereas the O.J. Simpson anthology majorly revolved around a courtroom drama, and season 2 is the murder of a kooky gay fashion designer, the tonal shifts between these seasons is jarring, and ultimately cheapen the legacy of the show. The first episode of season 2 starts with a grand orchestral score, and we're introduced to Gianni Versace walking around his luxurious manor in his designer loungewear, going about with his daily tasks. The scene is intercut with our introduction to Darren Criss playing Andrew Cunanan, the man who will go on to later kill Versace. And don't worry, this isn't a spoiler. We see Cunanan on a beach where he abruptly puts his book down in the sand, walks into the ocean fully clothed, and then screams at the sun. Because this is clearly the best way to show that this man has psychological problems. Already, it is noticeable that the stylization of the first season will not be carried over into the newer anthology. Instead of gritty grays to reflect a riot-torn Los Angeles, we see golds, reds, and oranges that reflect the warm, cheap Miami beaches. The intro scene continues on for 7 minutes with little else happening other than intercutting the lavish lifestyle of Gianni Versace and the anguished, overly melodramatic Cunanan. Finally, the two characters seem to be meeting, and then we see Andrew Cunanan shoot Gianni Versace. So, right away, we're presented with the ending of the entire season. Now, I understand that we know Cunanan was going to kill Versace anyways. I mean, how can you spoil a historical event? But with the O.J. Simpson anthology, we're not told outright that O.J. Simpson did or did not kill Nicole. The case, I suppose, still remains a mystery and controversy to this day, since O.J. was acquitted. But we all knew watching that season that O.J. would win the trial, and yet the show allowed suspense to build up to that moment throughout the entire season. But season 2 decides to undercut the rising tension that should culminate throughout by showing us the climax within the first 7 minutes. And all I can remember thinking to myself when I saw this episode was, why the fuck should I keep watching this garbage? Like, that's the ending. What? I'm good. I get it. I know what's happening. We're good. Right? We're good, right? We're good. Okay. The acting of this season also just seems so much less inspired. I love Darren Criss, mostly from his pre-fame days. And I know he did win many accolades for this role. That's a whole controversy in itself. But the entire time, his acting never feels genuine, like the acting did in season 1. Rather than being Cunanan, he seems to be playing a characterization of Cunanan. The articulation of his voice, his gestures, and his unnecessary garb feels very much like he's playing a kooky gay character rather than a real person. And for an anthology based off of true crime, it's weird to see a character that feels made up rather than real. And other than Darren Criss, there's no real standout role from the season that helps build any type of development to the rest of the story. There's no atmospheric appeal, no world building incorporated, and the main character's motivations are unclear. All we know of him pretty much throughout the entire season is that he's mentally ill. Just look at the difference in these shots. Look at the difference in the cast. Look at the difference in the stories they chose to portray. And it's very obvious that season 2 just feels like a cheap knockoff of what they were able to achieve prior.
Okay, so I'm editing this and I realized that I never gave a finality to my season 1 versus season 2 of American Crime Story. I want to say that season 2 wasn't total garbage. I know a lot of people actually liked that season, and the things I didn't like can be summed up in just saying that it's personal taste. But when you're comparing season 1 to season 2, where season 1 tackles one of the biggest cases in US history, as well as tackles issues of racial inequality in the United States, versus the second season where Ryan Murphy's like, let's do like a gay murder story and everything will be really campy. It takes itself less serious, and it's not the same show.
I think I have a theory for why Ryan Murphy's shows continually see declines between their initial seasons and the following. It seems as though Murphy loves to do new projects rather than one project fully through to the end successfully, like other show writers and producers. I think this may be why he loves anthology projects as well. After one season is done, he can start over and start fresh on a new story and fully devote his time and energy to that project. However, the more projects Murphy takes on, the less devoted he is to his older ones. So when season 2 of American Crime Story rolled around, it was no longer his baby anymore, as he had just begun working on his new anthology, Feud. I mean, think about it. The general consensus is that Glee jumped the shark around seasons 3 and 4, which aired in 2013 and 2014 respectively. By that point, Murphy had already been working on American Horror Story for 2 years in addition to Glee, and he had just started work for his newest show, the sleeper hit The New Normal. Kind of an underrated show, too. As he garnered more and more projects, he devoted much less of his time to working on ones he had already started, such as Glee, and I think we can all agree that that show tanks after a certain point. Eventually, the same would happen with American Horror Story, because he would start working on Scream Queens, yada yada yada. And let's be honest, American Horror Story hasn't been an amazing show since pre-Freak Show. I'm not saying all seasons since have been bad, but it's definitive that the best seasons were the first 3. Although Ryan Murphy has the uncanny ability to produce multiple shows with fascinating premises and get new, never-before-done shows greenlit for production, it comes with a caveat. His feigning interest in a new project sours when he's found something new to put his hands onto. His older project, which once was gold, has lost its luster. It is now worthless in the eyes of the audience, in the eyes of the network, and ultimately relegates his crew and cast to fend for themselves as he jumps onto the new project. With a lot of the same cast and crew, I don't know how to transition here.
I want what you have. Whatever it is that has kept you young all these years.
The hammer wants the nails magic. Oh, that is rich.
Another key characteristic of Ryan Murphy is his casting choices. First and foremost, I want to say that for the most part, Ryan Murphy casts very interestingly, giving actors who are oftentimes overlooked fabulous roles where they're able to really shine and garner publicity. I also think that Murphy has, more than most with positions of power, given at least slight attention to casting with more diversity. As the old Tumblr proverb said, say what you want about Glee, but at least the cast featured representation from gay to straight, white to black, and able-bodied to people with disabilities. There's also Pose, which casted black trans women specifically for the parts of black trans women. Now, did these shows perfectly humanize and showcase all of these diverse people justly? No, but at least he's not casting Scarlett Johansson as the mother of the House of Abundance. But when you look at the people he has given work, you kind of have to thank him a bit. I mean, he pretty much reinvigorated Jessica Lange's career and made her a household name for people under 30. He also was able to bring attention to the wonderful lesbian goddess that is Sarah Paulson. And even legendary actresses like Kathy Bates and Angela Bassett, well-respected and talented actresses in the field for decades, have had their careers invigorated by being in Ryan Murphy productions. I'm not saying he's the reason these actresses have thriving careers. I'm simply saying that his projects have allowed for more attention and spotlight to be given to them, helping to bolster their names in pop culture, and of course giving them great work. I do seem to be naming mostly women, however, in my praise for his casting choices. And that's because of another thing Ryan Murphy has become synonymous with, and that's casting his crush. Although Ryan Murphy has casted men inclusively, like Billy Porter and Cuba Gooding Jr., these are more of an exception than the rule. He tends to habitually cast the same white man in every single one of his projects. And I know you've seen the meme. White, tall, lean but muscular, dark coiffed hair, mid-20s, mid-30s. Yeah, I get it, Ryan. You find this type to be attractive, and you always cast them as the traditionally handsome guy in your shows, but could you please just bring a bit more Shazam into your male casting choices, because it's getting very stale. Seriously, if he casted men like how he casts women in his roles, I think it'd be really interesting and would help to bolster the careers of lesser-known male artists, much like he has done for several actresses. Think about all of the underrated male actors of yesterday and today and what a new role for them might be like and also do for their career. Not to mention casting more inclusive body types and ethnicities in his male roles like he has with actresses would help to fully round out shows and create more interesting dynamics for characters rather than just cliche handsome white male with dark hair. But I think he cast these people, yes, because he's attracted to them, but because he can kind of use their image to queerbait audiences. That's right, baby, saddle up, because we're gonna dissect the difference between queering content and queerbaiting content, and how Murphy has managed to do both. This last section is probably the most nuanced Murphyism, and I'm going to struggle to tackle it, but I'm gonna do my best. Like previous Murphyisms, it is both a good and bad thing that is a long-standing recurring theme, and that's his act of queerbaiting and queering television shows. Firstly, what exactly does it mean to queer something? Well, traditionally everything is produced or created through how most of the world views something, hence through the lens of a heterosexual narrative. When something is queered, it means to reimagine or imagine something for the first time as told through a queer lens, in an attempt to be more inclusive for a queer audience and create content that more nichely cues queers into the dogma of a show or creative project. In essence, it's creating queer content for consumption of queer people. Being a gay man himself, it's obvious that Ryan Murphy unapologetically creates shows that queer audiences would be more interested in seeing. We have Glee, which was one of the first mainstream television shows to more promiscuously feature homosexuality to broader audiences, as well as feature several characters who identify as gay, bi, trans. Not to mention, it's a show about glorified theater kids, and there's way too many gays that can identify with that. Then there's Feud, which so far only has one season and is based off of the so-called rivalry between Bette Davis and Joan Crawford, two aging Hollywood actresses that appeal more so to the queer zeitgeist than anything straights would find interesting. And of course, Pose, based off of the underground ball scene in New York in the late 80s, but more importantly made as a fictional version of the 1990 documentary Paris is Burning. I'm not mad that Ryan Murphy is creating content that appeals more specifically to gay people, but I am annoyed that most queer television is being made only by him. This isn't necessarily his fault, he's just trying to get as many shows made as possible. But it does limit the scope of queer media to only one content creator. And although I don't hate everything he's done, I do have many issues with the ways he wants to present queered content to audiences, especially in his fictionalized, idealistic ways that more often than not are outlandish and just are kind of used to distract from issues with writing. Feud, for instance, is almost entirely bullshit speculation based off of Murphy's own imagination of how Betty and Joan felt about each other. His dramatization of the duo's relationship with one another did not serve to report the truth about their dynamic to the audience, but rather to create dramatic plot lines in order to enhance the progress of the show. He writes between the lines of reality and fills in his own fictionalized ideals in order to queer his programming to be better suited for the audience's desire of living in an idealized world of
gay faggotry.
But he also uses it as a crutch when writing around conflicts created for his characters. Although Feud isn't accurate to the source material, I still actually liked a lot about the show. It did feel like it was something made for me, a gay man obsessed with old Hollywood, Jessica Lange, and ancient gossip. But knowing I'm not watching the truth, which could be just as nuanced and interesting as his fictionalized ideals if he actually cared to write about it, makes me mad that he lazily uses his own retelling of their story because he couldn't find ways to make the truth seem interesting. And it, actually really was. Again, watch this video. But when he attempted to reimagine the golden age of Hollywood in one of his newest series, titled Hollywood, he managed to completely try to sell fiction as truth, as if to say, if studios just took a chance on diversities in the 40s and 50s, we'd be living in some type of media utopia by now. I could probably write another entire script about my issues with this show in particular, so for the sake of brevity and trying to tie my point together smoothly, I'll try my best to be succinct. This show is literally written like it came straight out of Ryan Murphy's wet dream, and I'm not going to apologize for saying that. In his attempt to rewrite and queer history, we're basically left with shallow characters that face no real challenges other than one episode where the main characters need to raise funds for their movie independently, so they all decide to just be sexy male prostitutes, resulting in them meeting their fundraising goals in a simple montage. Another point of contention for this series is that it simply disregards historical things like the Hays Code of Hollywood ethics that were put in place at the time and banned things like homosexuality and miscegenation from being filmed and put in films distributed within the United States. I know this show is supposed to be fictitious reality, but it seems to forego all forms of reality that could lead to actual interesting development for characters and conflicts in order to show softcore porn with naked male leads that look like this. Do you kind of see what I mean? Queering media like television is great. It allows queer people to more closely engage with a project because it plays into things we as queer people would like to generally see more of in media. I just wish that the only major show writer and showrunner who is queering television wasn't a man with a limited scope of references that solely fulfills his own personal fantasies and uses his queer coding to simply make us forget about actual development within a story. There is a very good interview with Bob the Drag Queen and comedian Cole Escola about this, and you should go and watch that video for more on that as well. Murphy also grossly queerbaits audiences by using tactics like showing conventionally attractive men naked in order to create interest and buzz for the show, while also distracting from major issues in the show's writing. And Hollywood isn't the first time he's done this. While Murphy will obviously try to get as many of his own projects greenlit and produced, he also doesn't need to rely on the cheap gimmick of gay sex to drive viewership up. It doesn't ultimately create a good narrative and makes his shows appear shallow as a result. And Ryan Murphy's Hollywood was very, very shallow in his use of queerbaiting gimmick.
Again, I'm editing this video and I feel like it's very hard to wrap up this section as well. There is a big difference between queering, which is writing something for a gay audience and allowing them to feel included in that rewrite, because it plays to your audience and their sense of humor and things that they're interested in. And queer baiting, which is using things like naked men played by straight guys who are sexy, that's just something that's used to scandalize. Definitely recommend watching the Queering of Pee-wee's Playhouse to understand what queering is. Definitely watch the Be Kind Rewind video about the inaccuracies of the feud between Betty and Joan. And definitely watch the first couple of minutes of the Bob the Drag Queen and Cola Scola interview where they discuss the difference between writing jokes and gay content for straight people and writing jokes and gay content for queer people.
While a part of queering media is to more commonly and honestly show things like queer sex, because it's what we as a queer audience want to see normalized in our media, it shouldn't just be shown for the sake of it. It needs to actually make sense in the context of the storyline you as a writer are trying to tell your audience. Putting sex scenes and nudity, heterosexual or homosexual, either or, in your shows is purely a shock tactic that doesn't actually add to the narrative of your show, reiterates that it's nothing more than an attention-grabbing stunt meant to distract viewers from, I don't know, writing that would actually make sense. I feel as though I've just barely touched on the surface of the nuances of Ryan Murphy and his television career thus far, and where the ultimate timeline seems to be leading us. Like many pioneers, his legacy cannot simply be summed up by saying something like, he's done good and he's done bad. Instead, to fully understand his impact on television, we need to analyze the context surrounding his life and his projects, what the projects have and have not done successfully, and then start to string any commonalities that shape up similar themes of his work. While I tend to like most of Murphy's projects, I know that my fondness for them will only last for a couple of seasons before he leaves the projects behind for future endeavors. American Horror Story is truly one of my favorite shows, but everything after Coven to me has felt cheap, convoluted, or some combo of both. And although Glee was inspiring for a young gay kid like me, it definitely was milked for all it was worth, and that milk turned pretty sour in the end. And my disappointment with season 2 of American Crime Story showed me that future seasons of that show probably won't be worth watching, as it already had relegated to Murphy's typical stunts like queerbaiting in order to draw an audience. While Hollywood already seems like a distant project, Ratchet's reviews are already pouring in, praising Sarah Paulson's acting, but pretty much finding major flaws with all of Murphy's aspects of the show in ways that we've discussed. The only project Murphy is currently working on that I find both interesting and also hasn't been purely spoiled by gimmick or drop storylines yet is Pose. But I do have my problems with certain aspects of this show as well. I'm just happy that it has been able to draw attention to and spotlight many issues trans people of color have been facing in our country for generations, as well as paying an homage to a queer historical landmark in the United States. As for where Ryan Murphy's career will go from here, it's tough to say. But I hope that the industry as a whole will expand to make room for other queer writers, directors, and producers, rather than just relying on hiring Ryan Murphy's sole vision for creating the next big thing.